Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett. It's Wednesday, August 30th, 2023, and today we're coming to you live from the home office, and we're covering today three questions we've been hearing from international educators over the past 7 days. We've just returned from a 10-day trip to India last night, and boy, I tell you what, I'm a little bit beat. Had a good night's sleep, but picked up a little bit of something on the plane, as you do when you do international travel. It's inevitable. Picked up a little cold, so a little head cold today, but hopefully we'll get through this without too many issues. Thanks all for being a part of the conversation today. Really happy to be joining you today to talk about these three questions as we do each week. For those of you that are a bit new to the Roundup, we take our questions that we ask here on the Roundup each week from our newsletter, all the SMIE news fit to share. And that newsletter comes out on Monday mornings at about 9 a.m. Eastern. If you subscribe to the email version of that, you can do so at our website, smieconsulting.org/subscribe. You can go down to the newsletter piece, enter your email details, and we'll get you added to that subscription list. Alternately, if you prefer to get your international ed news via LinkedIn, we have a version of that goes out a little bit earlier at about 8:30 every Monday morning, and that has over 1,200 subscribers, on our way to 1,300 subscribers on that newsletter version, and then another 100 or so on the email version. So thanks so much for making our SMIE newsletter part of your weekly international edification. As we do, it takes a good amount of work to collate the news stories each week and put that together for you, but it is a labor of love for me. Had a chance to chat with some folks in India last week about the newsletter and about the Roundup, and they were thanking me for that. And I said, hey, it's my service to my field. I've been in the business now 30 years in international education. It's something I really enjoy, sharing my insights, kind of the hot takes on Monday in the newsletter, and then the lives here on Wednesday afternoons. I know most people don't watch the lives, and that's fine. We're all busy, very busy people, and all around the world, so you can't always be up at 1 p.m. Eastern time to catch these lives. But we thank you for subscribing, listening to the podcast, and just making it a regular part of your weekly journey through our shared field of international education. So let's get to our first question. First question of the day is, what happens when students cut corners? And I tell you what, this is one of those things that we talk about all the time in reference to students from certain countries that get themselves into issues during either their admissions process, the visa process, and there's a lot of different hurdles they have to clear with their financial documents, their academic documents, to actually go to convince a university to admit them to get an I-20, then convince a U.S. consular officer to give them a visa and allow them to enter the country. But that's not the last step in getting that visa. They actually have to make it through Customs and Border Patrol. And for many of us in the field, we kind of have a love-hate relationship, mostly hate, with our Customs and Border Patrol people. On the SCVP side as well, we have our whole Department of Homeland Security. We all have our challenges working with them because of the backlogs and short staffing situations they encounter that delay recertification requests and RFEs that pour in that don't seem to make a whole lot of sense for that. And then we have different branches of Homeland Security dealing with our inbound students, with the Customs and Border Patrol. And this is where we really, there's a lot of unknowns. We don't know the individual circumstances of every student that gets turned away at the border or gets denied entry or gets sent back home. But we had this case a couple weeks ago. The news started breaking, and then certainly last week while it was in India, this was the focus of a lot of coffee break conversations about what's happening with these 21 students. How did they get to that point where they entered the U.S. and then were turned away before they could enter? So this is what the story's about. So the Pi News did a piece on this. There are a lot of local Indian sites that had stories about this last week. And what I found very interesting before leaving, and I was right just as I was leaving for this trip, we started seeing a number of our agents in the field in India start picking up on this story and then posting particularly on LinkedIn and sharing reminders. This is the cautionary tales for their current advisees not to cut corners. And that's what the question is really about: what happens when students cut corners? This is what happened with these Indian students that decided it was more important for them to make plans to, once they got into the country, for illegal work, for other various things that was found out upon investigation when these students were taken to secondary. They were asked in there, apparently, from the reports I'm hearing from agents on the ground, that's Indian agents who might have known the agencies that these students went through to go to the U.S., that they went into secondary review after they could not adequately explain where their funding was coming from. Then, per the regulations that now allow Customs and Border Patrol officials to review social media messaging apps, take devices and review the data that's on there to see if there's anything that suggests that their purpose is not what they say it is. And enough evidence was found that on their devices to show that they were not really serious students in the end. That in the end, the bank statements, though we don't have the exact evidence for every 21 of these students that were returned home. We don't know all the details, but several folks have conjectured that they had information in WhatsApp messages that indicated that they wanted to work, work illegally, and people were setting them up with jobs. So there was that going on. So there wasn't funding, as many students do. It's a kind of a rite of passage for students going from India to the U.S., but other countries as well. That money is put into a central account to allow a bank statement to be produced for a period of time to meet the requirements of individual institutions in terms of how long the money has to be in there. Sometimes that's not even a requirement, just has to show the bank statement with the money on account. And then that's what is needed to issue the I-20. And then when the I-20 is issued, the money kind of disappears back to the original sources of who donated the money so the bank statement could be given. So that happens, and that's likely what happened in this case as well, that it puts students in a situation when, if they never really had the money that they said they were going to have, they arrive in the country and their plan to solve their financial issues, that they knew they didn't have the money to pay for all their expenses, particularly their tuition, they would work off campus illegally. And that's something in the U.S. It is fairly, it's unique to the U.S. Out of the major destinations. Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand all allow students to work off campus. Doesn't even have to be directly related to their field, but they can work off campus. Other countries we saw during the pandemic, Canada, Australia, allowed students to work more than the maximum number of hours per week, which had been 20. So that's universal, seems to be, in terms of maximum number of hours, but the ability to work off campus is restricted in the U.S. until students are able to do that, usually through curricular practical training, usually after a year of academic year of study. They have the ability to apply for practical training, and then if it's approved, work off campus in their field of study, but in very limited terms. In other destination markets, that's not the case. So those students that come here, they don't have a lot of choice coming to the United States if they're going to campuses that don't have a lot of funding, don't have assistantships typically for first-year students. Then the choices are fairly limited in terms of how they're going to actually pay for their education. And students tend to find those outlets and opportunities to earn maximum money, more than they would earn on campus, and potentially more than the 20 hours a week that they wouldn't been able to work on campus anyway. So that's the real challenge that many of these students face. And having been on the international student scholar side in terms of being responsible for for verifying that these students are in status, maintaining their status throughout their stay. When you end up seeing some of those same students who pleaded poverty immediately after arriving on campus, and then end up seeing them in stores and restaurants that working illegally, what are you supposed to do? And that's something that most international offices and their staff have to deal with, because they live and work in the areas that these students are also living. So it's a real challenge. So cutting these corners, particularly on the financial side, everybody knows students want to minimize the amount that they have to spend to get their education. That's natural and that's perfectly allowable, but you still have to have the money you say you have in order to be able to get your I-20 initially, convince a consular officer that you're worthy of that, and then also the Customs and Border Patrol person. So there's 3 real steps related to financials that students have to overcome to get into the United States and be able to start attending college. And are those steps always going to catch everybody who might be trying to cut corners? No, it's not. And the students that were caught didn't do a good enough job, apparently, of convincing the consular Border Patrol officer, or not consular, Customs and Border Patrol officer, that their funding was legitimate. And when there is doubt, there is doubt. And then when the secondary assessment was done in that windowless room, this is where the truth comes out. And when their devices were analyzed and found to be inaccurate, or having messaging that reflected that their intent was not to become students, that their intent was really to work illegally, and that is not allowed. When that's found out, they were sent home. So I think it's the cautionary tale piece that a number of our agents that we're working with who sent messages after the news had broken in India, they're sending messages out on LinkedIn to their students and to all students that might be following them that, hey, don't even think about going until your funding is guaranteed, until you know you have the funds to pay for your education. And this is not a unique situation to the United States. It's unique in that students are limited once they come to working on campus for that first year, if they're not enrolled in a curricular practical training program that allows that. But that's in terms of allowing them to work off campus in their field of study. But for most students, in other countries as well, we saw it back when the Pi Live Australia had their student panel, that students were complaining that, hey, we should be able to make a living wage. And I go, well, you're students. You're not workers necessarily. That's not your main purpose of being in country. You actually said when you first entered the country, you had to document you had the funding to pay for your studies, and now you're coming and you can't do that. So it's a similar story, not unique to the U.S., but in Australia they're having these issues too, that they should deserve to be able to work enough to pay their bills. And in an ideal world, maybe that would be the case, but the rules and regulations don't allow that now, not only in the United States, but in other countries as well, to be able to work enough hours to be able to pay for your education. That's just not the way the systems are set up in any country, really. So, of the major destinations. So, in terms of cutting corners, we don't want that. No institution wants to be admitting and enrolling students that are not able to pay their bills. Obviously, there are occasions when tragedy strikes a family with their sponsors, a father, grandfather, whatever, who's had been paying the bills, suddenly dies. That happens. I've known dozens of cases like that over the years. You have situations when currencies just tank and economies collapse, and as a result, the funding that students have to pay their bills gets gets severely compromised. You have wars that break out that affect families' abilities to get money out to pay bills. So there's all sorts of very rational reasons why funding issues come into play after students enroll. But this case here with these 21 Indian students is clearly the former. It's the kinds of subterfuge that goes on, probably more than we know, in terms of being able to get through those three gatekeepers: the individual institutions that verify funding before they issue the I-20, the consular officer at the embassy or consulate that reviews before they can issue the visa, and then the Customs Border Patrol officer that has the final say on whether that student can enter into the United States. Most of us on the immigration side, international student side, don't really wish that person didn't have that much power, but the reality is every student coming in, every person that comes through across the borders, there are standards that they all must meet, and for students there's a certain set of standards that these Border Patrol officers are tasked with preventing non-legitimate actors entering the United States, or students in this case entering the United States. So they have a very tough job, and they work some very odd hours. They work long hours, like many of us do these days, but they're not perfect people. We're not perfect people, and no one is. But those are the challenges that students must face, is that in terms of being honest, being upfront, being able to make your case as you had done earlier with the visa officer, and submitting your documents to your university. So all of those steps, by the time you get to a Customs Border Patrol agent, you should have that process down and should be able to argue effectively that you have all the money that you say you have, and here are the legitimate sources. All of that should be well documented, and students should not have issues convincing a Customs Border Patrol if it's legit. If it's not legit, then there are tells that you'll probably get found out. So don't cut corners, and that's in the bottom line. That's the advice. So in all areas of life, I think cutting corners rarely leads to very positive outcomes, and on a consistent basis. And there's ethical considerations in here too, in terms of the students' willingness to subvert the rules and to and do things that they're not allowed to do. And again, this is all conjecture. There's hearsay and all these other evidence pieces that we never know the individual stories of these students. Every time and this is the time of year where there usually are maybe a series of these happening as students come into the country and are denied entry or put in secondary, or go through some very ominous hurdles, it seems like, or jump through some hoops that we would say, wow, I have to do that. When the reality is, yeah, they do, and when that's on the burden on those Customs and Border Patrol officers to get it right, and they don't always get it right. But we don't always get it right when we issue the documents in the first place, because that's part of our challenge too as institutions. Is we have a role to play in verifying funding, and there are a number of folks out there that have trying to crack that nut. Funds verification has been one of those. Cheryl Darrett-Boychuk that I've worked with in the past on different projects. She has had that company now for a while, and India has been their kind of proving grounds for making that work, and the ways to verify funding and how long it's been in the account and all of those various issues. There are some agents that won't in India that won't work with students unless they've verified their funding as well. So there's even other actors that are the experts on the ground that can help in this role. So it's a deep and messy question on funding for students to really explore in depth. But I'm sure you're having similar conversations on your campus, and I'd really be eager to have additional conversations with you as time permits in the weeks and months to come. Now, on to our second question of the day, and that is, how can the U.S. advance international student recruitment and enrollment? And this is coming, as if you hadn't guessed, from AIRC's recent recommendations to the federal government to provide a more cohesive, unified, and connected approach towards international student enrollment in the United States and recruitment in the United States. And I'm going to be sharing a couple articles with you here. One is actually the the AIRC document itself that lists the different, the two main recommendations that they're making, and then the ISIF monitor piece that picks up on that. Just a quick heads up, Karen Fisher in her Latitude column newsletter also had the main story was about this initiative. And I think what's important in the way AIRC has gone about this, they're not trying to position themselves as the ultimate expert in the room, because they see and make clear that they're trying to add value to the other thought leaders and partner associations, organizations that have already been have made put rather substantive and specific recommendations to the government for what those big steps can and should be. That and in their request, or what their recommendations are, the purpose that they outline are to articulate AIRC's distinctive vision for how international student enrollment to the U.S. can grow and succeed, to complement the recommendations made by other associations and organizations, to influence the broader conversations on U.S. international education policies and the development of a national strategy, and that's a goal that we all share in the field. The government hasn't yet shared that vision in terms of what that looks like. They have their own major federal agencies doing their own thing, as we've talked about on the roundup before. Commerce now has international ed as a major component of their national export strategy. You have Department of State that is doing what they can to increase awareness of and appointment slots for visas in certain key markets. You have Department of Homeland Security trying to present a more streamlined process for international students to navigate when they enter the United States and then while they're in the United States. But there's no interwoven connectedness between those strategies in terms of a lead from the top, from the White House, in terms of direction for that international ed strategy. So this is really something that I'm certainly supportive of AIRC in their attempts to put these recommendations forward and to influence the broader conversation again on U.S. international ed policies. And the final purpose of these recommendations be a primary resource for AIRC's advocacy for expanding U.S. international student enrollment. So in terms of what their recommendations are, the preamble is kind of laying the foundation of where AIRC fits in the scheme of landscape of international education associations and thought leadership and all of that. They, in terms of their as the membership association, that is a standards development organization, SDO, in the United States. They put forth two recommendations for advancing international student recruitment and enrollment in the United States to help make the U.S. the undisputed premier destination for international students. And part of this is it's in response to what we talk about almost weekly on the Roundup, is the need for perspective, a global perspective on international education. Because we know we are not the only ones out there doing what we're doing. And we have other countries that are much more nimble in terms of how they approach international education, that have educational policies, immigration policies that reflect a national strategy and reflect a willingness to simplify processes and to allow for dual intent. We see, so we'll touch on that in our third question on the day as when we get to Australia. But we've seen what a benefit Canada has received in terms of enrolling international students, talking some outrageous numbers for that country in the next year. So there's so much going on here, and what most of us on the ground, if we're newer to our institutions and we are newer to the field, we probably don't have that kind of a global perspective on how competitive it really is for institutions that are trying to recruit students from overseas, that we're not just competing against our competitor institutions domestically here in the United States, we're competing against universities in dozens of other countries that might be going after the same students we are. And it's not just the UK, Canada, Australia anymore. It's China, it's France, it's Germany that are also eagerly going after the same students we're looking at. So having that perspective, and I think AIRC's approach here in their recommendations, and we'll go through those. Recommendation number 1, promote the many and diverse U.S. educational entry points to expand access to international student mobility. And we always hear, when we hear about international education, we always think of post-secondary education, right? So the reality is international students come into the United States at all levels, from kindergarten through K through 12 schools, secondaries, public and private secondary schools, community colleges, English language programs, as well as undergraduate and graduate institutions. So it's also, it goes a little bit a step further than I've seen it taken before. We also see short-term exchange programs, volunteer programs, work and cultural programs, online learning, looking at au pairs and other visa categories that that bring people to the United States that may have an interest in studying at some point. So, but there are a range of options that are out there, but there's little connectivity between the two in terms of changing of status, and the processes can be very cumbersome for those that want to transition from one to another and see the real value. And these recommendations here are meant to spark conversation, frankly, amongst all of us in the field. They really are attempting to paint the picture much more broadly than we have ever done before as a nation, in terms of allowing the world to come to us for a variety of reasons, at a variety of levels and entry points, and that can, connecting the dots, allow them to connect the dots and make those transitions a much smoother process that want to come in for more of a longer educational journey than what they initially intended. So the action points that they recommend under this first recommendation: identify and promote model practices that demonstrate the benefits of a wide variety of educational entry points. Train those who advise and counsel students abroad about the diversity of educational entry points. Promote multiple entry points to students, their families, and stakeholders so that they are aware of the robust educational choices students have. So this is also on us and the folks that we work with abroad to get the word out. Increase the attractiveness of student educational entry points by providing evidence on how the opportunities are an excellent value. And there's some of that out there for some of us, like on the university side, the economic value and all of that, but there's a lot more to it, of course. Advocate for improving the processing of student and exchange visitor visas to make entry to and transition between educational opportunities as seamless as possible. And all of us, I think, would like to see that. The transitions from visas categories to one to another. Other than the exchange visitors that come and have a 2-year home residency requirement that requires them to go back home, that's something that we really can't change. That's a legal requirement of some parts of the J visa. Not everybody has that on a J visa. And finally, to promote and conduct training on enrollment management standards and best practices that support the features of international student mobility. So that's, again, a broader one affecting all of us in the industry. But there are some pieces in here that are government focused. There are pieces here that are stakeholder focused overseas. There are many of these focuses are on us as institutions and international education providers. The second recommendation is to facilitate connections between entry points to support international student mobility. So recommendations here are really looking at the English language to university or community college role, to linking entry points. Those are the common ones we hear about, from high school to college level. Those are the ones that can, well, as they say, instead of entry points that are well integrated horizontally and vertically so that students can easily map out their educational paths, currently students often encounter institutional and programmatic silos without clear road signs between them. So that's kind of the present situation, is kind of siloed and not very clear. And the ideal would be to have integrated horizontally and vertically entry points throughout the educational system for students from overseas. So the recommended actions for this recommendation: highlight models of articulation that links entry points into educational pathways, I don't like the word pathways, no one really does, but it has so many different meanings in our business, to serve as examples for institutions and students to emulate, advocate for policies and financial practices that support international students' access to funding to support their international education avenues, and support greater portability of international students' educational credentials and transfer opportunities by adopting the principles that UNESCO recently put out called a Convention on the Recognition of Qualifications Concerning Higher Education in the European Region. So a couple other things in there: articulation databases and assessment practices, assessment of life skill equivalencies, non-standardized aptitude tests, scorecards, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of different things there, but that we could go into. But the reality is here, these recommendations that is that for the U.S. as a whole, government obviously needs to be a main driver in this, that these many entry points for people looking to come here for education of some kind that aren't actively promoted. We hear higher ed promoted, but we don't necessarily hear, and it's mostly university education, we don't necessarily hear all the ancillary pieces that can involve educational options at some point during their individual's journey. So these recommendations are fairly deep and involve not just the higher ed sphere. It involves English USA, Association of Boarding Schools, TABS, and other associations that really are the main stakeholders domestically in bringing students from abroad to the U.S. So I'm really happy to see this. Because it's not just a USG focused thing. I think there's some great value we can all take from putting together the necessary pieces on our own campuses, and how we talk about international entry points for students that want to have educational options as part of their journey to us. So all of this is to say that these recommendations are great, and I know many in the international higher ed community would endorse these wholeheartedly. There's not a lot of the recommendations. There are not a lot of real action points that to specific folks on the government side, which I think we need to use as a kind of starting point for those conversations. What does that look like to allow smoother transitions in between visa categories, to promote these more broadly, to show that the U.S. is a more welcoming destination and should be continue to be the premier destination. We're seeing our competition gain on us across the board in a lot of cases. And a country like Canada that has less than a tenth of the universities and colleges that we have in the United States, they're now poised to have 900,000 international students in the next year, and that's vocational and university level study. So we're basically getting back up to 1 million students now in our database. So they're gaining fast, but with a tenth of the volume of institutions than we have. They're having a lot of problems up there. They're talking about a cap, which is part of the next question that we'll cover. But competition is getting more fierce for these same students, and until we recognize that, not just on our own campuses and how we develop our own strategies for international student recruitment, but how we advocate to the government that, hey, it's a competitive playing field out there and we're not keeping up. That this gets to our third question: how quickly can visa policy be changed? We have been talking about immigration reform in this country since the 80s. There's been so little done, constructive things done to allow for real change to happen, and it gets caught up in politics every single time. Presidents on both sides of the aisle have had ambitious immigration reform plans over the last 2 decades, 3 decades even, but so little has actually gotten done. I mean, think it's back since 1988 or so, 86, 88, the Immigration Reform Act was passed, and that was the last substantive change. That we had the DREAM Act that was passed by Congress, and then that's been debated, and those dreamers are still in limbo. That hasn't been really identified. So we're in a position here in the United States where we don't have there's not a collective wisdom, collective energy, and again, lacking a national policy on immigration, as other countries have in Australia, in the UK, to a lesser extent in Canada. They say they don't have one, but they have policies that certainly allow for international education to develop a policy for the country. But we're seeing other destinations, and we're going to talk about Australia and Canada here in our two main examples that we're going to cover here. We've talked in the past few months about what's happening in the UK. They had a new government that started that had come in and after Boris Johnson left, and then there was an interim PM. But now, when the Rishi Sunak government took office, they put forth a very, in lack of a better phrase, anti-international education agenda that sought to restrict international students coming to the UK. They succeeded in passing with a concern over net migration numbers reaching record levels and the number of dependents that were coming with students, particularly for one-year master's programs, and then they were counting in the net migration numbers, and that it has impacts on services that the country offers, all of that. There was a very, not swift, it took a few months, but they were able to ban dependents coming from all but doctoral level programs into the UK. So that is a significant shift. We've also seen there be talks about low quality degrees, international students not being able to enroll in those. And this one has a little bit more of a, that particular one hasn't particularly passed. I don't think it's passed yet, but they're dealing with, what constitutes a low quality degree. And this isn't necessarily the art majors and these kind of things, but low quality degrees from institutions that maybe are just trying to get international student into programs that aren't really leading to jobs and are just a revenue builder for the institution, all that. So that's been happening in the UK. So they've had a government that come in and has been able to institute substantive change that affects international student interest in that country, though they're up 23% for visas issued for the fall. So in the UK, we'll talk more about that in next week's edition, I'm sure. But the two examples I want to give you are, in addition to the UK one we just touched on, are in Australia and Canada. Australia is proposing two different significant changes to visa policy that I'm just amazed at how quickly it's being done. But it's being done in a country that values international education at all levels. It's government policy. There is a national strategy, all of that. And first of one is banning concurrent enrollment in a crackdown on dodgy providers. So this is a loophole that had existed that allows international students to switch to cheaper providers shortly after arriving in the country in a crackdown on these dodgy providers. That ministers have warned, and it's from a Pi News article, that they may begin banning high-risk institutions from recruiting overseas. So that's interesting. That the amount of money students need to be eligible for visas is set to increase, which may push out some of these dodgy providers anyway. So that is this growing concern that unscrupulous educational providers are misusing the policy that had existed that allowed students to switch. Normally that's a 6-month policy. The policy now had normally allowed for 6 months. So this is sort of the equivalent of our transfer outs in the United States. In Australia, the policy had been allowed that students had to wait 6 months to change providers. But this loophole had allowed them to do so much more quickly than the universities that enrolled them would have allowed. So this is that increased substantially in 2023. Up to 17,000 of these concurrent enrollments compared to 10,500 in the pandemic era 2019 to 2022. So that's interesting to see. This was a change that universities have been clamoring for a while, but now they're closing that loophole, and that will prevent this from becoming exploited again. So that's great. What Australia is also doing is they may allow, and this isn't confirmed yet, but they may allow students to indicate their desire to migrate when they're in the visa application process. The reality of the the reality of the situation is that many, particularly coming from Australia for vocational studies, were generally called two-step migrants. They're coming to do the quick, easy vocational degree, then that would continue on to allow them to work in Australia with intent of not going home. So this is now kind of what we would want to have for F1 students, to have dual intent, that they could could stay in the United States to work after they're finished with their studies, but because it's a non-immigrant visa category, they can't say that as part of their interview for a visa when they go to the U.S. consulate or embassy abroad. So this is something that international students going to Australia, if this passes, would be able to declare that they want to be two-step migrants. So very interesting, and I know I'm going way over today, and I guess I just had so much to say after this trip and these this conversation on all three of these topics today are fairly meaty. But we'll touch on two things that Canada is also doing just very quickly. The links are going to be in the chat on the social pages, but you can also go back to the newsletter from Monday to get that as well, which the links are also to that are in the chat. Canada is looking to modernize student visa program with a trusted institution framework that would designate designated learning institutions. Some of them would be trusted institutions that would get expedited visa processing. And if you're not, then I guess it's normal visa processing. But who doesn't want to be in that trusted institution category? That's interesting. Probably be some heavy debate on that. And then also, Housing Minister is throwing around the possibility of a cap on international student numbers in Canada. They are at 800,000 this year, and that includes vocational and university level studies. So will that happen in Canada? That would certainly push a lot of folks off Canada as a destination. And hearing from some agents on the ground, in India, Canada's falling off a little bit in terms of interest there. So there's a lot of movement, obviously, that happens in international ed every year with students coming and going. This is the time of year when all that's happening. But and good luck to all of you who have just recently welcomed or about to hundreds of thousands of international students on your campuses. All the best to you in this most exciting time of year. We'll talk more about that in the weeks and months to come, I'm sure, about what the leading up to Open Doors in November, what travels are going to be occurring between now and then. We'll certainly be sharing what's going on with us at UNLV and where I'll be traveling in the coming weeks. But we'll talk more about that next week. Until then, we wish you all the very best and have a great day. Cheers.